Hello, everyone. We're excited to be here at South by Southwest for our educational panel. I'm Mary Hawkins. I'm president of Bellevue University, and I will pass the baton now.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you, Mary, and also with you, Michael. Paul LeBlanc, president of Southern New Hampshire University.
Hi, I'm Michael Sorrell, and I am the president of Paul Quinn College in Dallas, Texas. And it's always wonderful to be here at South by Southwest, but especially today when I get to spend time with my friends, Mary and Paul. What I thought we could possibly get started with today is to talk about how universities and their communities can build a tighter collaboration with employers to ensure that students are getting the most value of the college education and are going to be the best equipped that they can be post-COVID. Even before the pandemic hit, if we're honest, we've been focused on democratizing higher education and giving working adults the opportunity to access education in order to unlock their true potential. We know that fewer students are pursuing the traditional paths to college. The National Student Clearinghouse research says that 16% fewer freshmen enrolled in college this semester than last fall. Now, we're not exactly sure how much to assign to COVID, but what we do know is that is a trend moving in a direction that none of us want to see. At Paul Quinn College, we've been thinking about this challenge and how employers can play a larger role. And quite frankly, it's part of the reason why several years ago we moved to an urban work college model and why we're so excited about our partnership with Guild and Guild Education and what all that can mean. But I'm not the only one who's thinking about these things. And I know that Mary and Paul have both deeply been involved and deeply concerned about these issues. So why don't we start with Paul? Paul, how are you guys at Southern New Hampshire thinking about the enrollment challenges?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because we are so largely online. We're so reasonably well positioned for making our way through the pandemic. And I would make this observation that's obvious as soon as you hear me say it, which is that in a pandemic, if you are an analog business, things are more challenging. If you're a digital business, things are probably thriving. So we've had this huge surge of enrollments from 135,000 in March to 167,000 today. And it's been crazy to keep up with that. But I do see, and I think one of the critical issues for us is the way in which the pandemic has shined a much harsher light on questions of inequity. And we do worry about our more fragile learners, and by fragile, I mean people have less social capital, who are lower income, and you get into questions of, do they have the right equipment? Do they have connectivity? Are they in jobs in which they can't have a reliable schedule? So if you don't have a reliable schedule, it's very hard to commit to synchronous classes. So you really start to unpack below the surface, and the admissions recruitment challenge gets really critical for underserved populations and communities. And then we're spending a lot of time trying to sort through that. And the things we do, of course, are we created a $5 million social justice fund that includes emergency aid to students who find themselves in those situations or who are suffering housing insecurity. It's interesting, in the CARES Act, emergency funds that were available to students, our number one demand, 62%, was food insecurity. Yeah. I mean, think about that. So we had to make thousands of grants to people who weren't sure where they're going to eat tomorrow. I think this has been said many times, but the degree to which the pandemic has shown a light on higher ed's inequities is, I think we knew it, but I think it's shocking in its true dimensions. We're spending a lot of time thinking about that piece.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think when I think about what Southern New Hampshire does, and when I think about, Mary, what you all do in terms of the group of students that you're educating, they often aren't the students that people think about when their mind wanders to traditional college students. But there's a huge need out there. So Mary, how are you all at Bellevue dealing with these issues?
You hit upon, I think, a really key point for possibly all three of us. And that is that our missions have focused on adult learners, working learners who are going back. And I think that similar to Paul, we've experienced enrollment growth over this period of time. And I think it is because of the fact that your focus on adult learners, your focus on making learning as convenient as possible, which is what drove us into online in the late 90s, is really key. But I think even more than the fact that we've historically, and I think really in our DNA, worked on what works for adult learners, working learners. What's really, I think, also an impact right now is the number of displaced workers who aren't sure what, and it goes probably back to your point, Paul, about food insecurity and other insecurities. Where's that job going to be? What am I going to be able to do in the future? And how am I going to afford it? And so as I think further about adult learners, and especially the impact of the pandemic, I think about those people whose jobs have changed or whose jobs have disappeared. And it's unclear to all of us. I don't think any of us have a crystal ball around what jobs are coming back and what are those changes going to be. And so I think that access is critical, but it's also access to the kinds of programs and to the, how do we give them a helping hand up or a step up? I think our colleges' jobs have changed slightly to be more focused on sometimes how do we identify the skill-based programs that will help them. And it's not just degree programs, it's also the short course training programs. And it's finding that real key to where jobs will go and at least building skills that will be transferable to many jobs, thinking about them in terms of access and shorter course to get them back into the job market more quickly and on a path. I think all three of us have really been focused on some innovation. And that's one thing I think that the pandemic has done is it's caused a real look at how we do the learning, both in online and residential classes, how we leverage technology, and then how we reach more students to give them that leg up, I would say. But I know both of you also have some short course training programs that you may want to introduce as well as we are with the certificate programs.
I'll tell you, we have moved to a format where literally that becomes the standard experience at Paul Quinn. So, you know, what we're offering is a model where students get 3 forms of training, right? They get their traditional subject matter expertise, which is what they decide to major in. Then they get experiential learning because every student is required to participate in the work program. And our work program, students go out and we find them jobs in the community where they work 15 to 16 hours per week for both semesters. So every semester you're there, you get a real world job, which helps you apply what you're learning in class, but also gives you a toehold into an opportunity post-graduation. But then right before the pandemic hit, we introduced our certificate programs, where every year students have the opportunity to get 1 to 2 digital certificates that they can then apply in the workspace. So, you know, we're charging all in $16,000 a year. And so we tell people for less than $65,000 total for 4 years, you're going to walk away with a minimum of 4 certificates, a degree, and 4 years of real world work experience. And, you know, as we try and explain to folks, we think we have given you the best chance to adapt to a rapidly changing environment. Like we've hedged our bets about as well as we can hedge them in this environment.
It's such a powerful proposition that you offer, Michael, and I think I want to come back. Both of you are responding to this fundamental challenge I think our industry faces, which is we know that the problem we have to be part of, that we have to address and solve, is this question of massive unemployment. As you said, Mary, we don't know how many jobs won't come back, but we do know what happened in the last recession, which is 60% of people who went back to work did it in jobs that they didn't have at the beginning. Those jobs went away. One report out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia is that at least 40% of these jobs will go away. So we think about, well, you know, stores may open again and retail may come back. Well, I don't know. A lot of us are very used to now getting our groceries delivered online or getting other things delivered online. And the people who are going to be displaced in that are going to be predominantly, as you know, Black and brown people. And what are the jobs that they come back to? And by the way, when we think of things like retail, there's a whole back office that's getting automated. So it's not just the person in the store who's helping you choose that jacket that you're interested in. It's the whole supply chain. And robots don't get COVID. and you're seeing a sort of rapid increase in automation. So we have to be thinking about what are the skills bundles, and I love, Michael, the way you talk about this, and Mary, both of you, what are the skills bundles that can actually propel somebody into a real meaningful job with meaningful increases in pay? Because here's the problem from a regulator's perspective. Higher ed has kind of a lousy history on short-term programming. There was a lot of bad programming out there. We've got to be linked directly to employers. Like we have to be able to draw the line the way that you both do. And that means, in being in much more deliberate conversation with employers, using data to look at real skills, real demands, real competencies, things like burning glass, or actually, right, mapping back to your program design, really operating differently than much of higher ed has operated in the past. I think, like you both, degrees are going to continue to be really important, the most important milestones. But we know that, and this is again that Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank study, that with a moderate set of skills, you can take somebody and move them into a job that pays anywhere between 15 and 40% more than the job they just lost. That's a win. They get back to work and they're making more money and they're taking care of their family. The challenge is how much of higher ed can actually be part of that. How much of higher ed is willing to do that kind of work, that kind of programming, shorter term programming, skills-based programming. And yes, we want it to be stackable, and yes, we want it to be on a pathway to a degree. But the idea that everyone comes out of high school and goes to college for 4 years and then gets a degree and gets a job that takes them through the rest of their career, that's not the way work happens anymore. We're going to have to build to have people come in and out of a learning ecosystem. And we'll always have students who want those 4 years in a row, and that's great. Like we all do that. All three of us can do that. But we're going to have a lot of students who are like, no, give me that 6-month skills package that gets me to work right away, and then let me build on my pathway as opportunity and circumstances allow. That's I think our critical challenge of how we move away from a 19th century industrial model of higher ed to really a workforce focused, because that's the number one job we're being asked to do today, with all of those soft skills, by the way. People like to do this opposition. It's skills or knowledge. Like, no, you can't separate those two things. They always go together.
Right.
Paul,
Paul, you bring up an interesting point in that it is about the short-term skills, but it's something that they can bank
Yep.
and use later, and how we leverage their learning. And also that close connection to the corporations who help us understand, here's where I'm going to have jobs, here's the kind of skills I need. That partnership that we have with Guild that allows a corporation to come into a network and be able to see what SNU, what Paul Quinn, what BU, what do we do and how do we make that match? And then how do we make it affordable? And I think underpinning all this, and Paul, Michael, you talked exactly about it with Paul Quinn's great competitive tuition rates, but we can't saddle the students with debt. So we really have to find ways for the creative funding streams that they can have, which do come from getting them into the job market and leveraging corporate tuition assistance, their own Pell, other kinds of aid that they've got, university aid, and making something not only skills-based and relevant, but affordable and something that gives them that employment leg up.
Yeah, I think what both of you are describing is a fundamental environment shift. Right.
Mhm.
It's an environment shift from being institutions that are obsessed, and I would argue in an unhealthy way, in love with our traditions and becoming more in love with our students. Right. Because if you actually were in love with your students, you would look and say, what do they need now? What do they need to have the lives that they should have? And then it's also just a basic fundamental acceptance of the marketplace, how it's shifted. The majority of students in the American public school system are coming from low-income families, right? That's our reality. The entire southern half of the country has tipped incredibly far into that statistic. So that means that the students coming out of our schools now are Pell Grant students.
Mhm.
And if they are Pell Grant students, then you have to be wired to meet their needs. And you can't import students from China to hide the fact that, you have tuition gaps or revenue gaps. You're going to have to actually understand what the employers want, understand what the students want, and design a system that allows you to do that. And that means it's going to change the way you recruit students as well.
Don't you think, Michael, to your point, much of our industry talks a good game about their concern for students, but in reality, most of our institutions are built around themselves, right? We make students feel lucky to get in. We make them go through an application process. You come in, it's a kind of one size fits all. You live, fill in the blank, that culture, that experience on its terms. It's the rare institution that I think is genuinely student-centered, that can really wrap itself around a student's needs with all of the demands on their time and flexibility. And I'll just take a look at the rigidity of our class schedules. We would never build class schedules the way we do around real students' lives for whom time is a dramatic deficit. They're juggling work and kids, and they're working way too many hours in order to be enrolled. And when you trap people into rigid schedules of time, so I'm on this sort of obsession these days with time as the enemy of low-income students. So we're very interested in non-time-based programs. And I think that's really one of the breakthroughs. This is a shameless plug for my forthcoming book, but it's going to argue that that the credit hour has really been a sort of terribly flawed measure. It doesn't actually measure learning, and it really disadvantages low-income students. It's an instrument of inequity, in my view.
Paul, gives us an opportunity to think differently too. And I already know that the three of us are doing this, but I think that it's worth emphasizing to the audience that access and equity also mean respect for the learning that students have had
For sure.
elsewhere. Community colleges, other colleges, corporate learning, you name it, there's a variety of ways students learn. And I think one of the rigid things, and I was on the phone with our group who work in community colleges, which we have a network of community college promise. And they said to me, Mary, we have such trouble because people don't believe that we accept transfer, no matter what we say. And they want these long articulation agreements instead of us saying, we accept your transfer credits. I said, that's because of the players who've said that and don't. They start lining out, well, that English won't count, and that math won't count, and that statistics won't count. You have to do ours. And I think that's the other place where both the Guild and the partnership that we have and the respect for other institutions, that does not bring us down. We're all growing because we do those right things for students. We leverage corporate tuition to the full extent that we can. We leverage student time and dollars to the full extent we can, not take away and make them repeat and spend more.
This is what we know, right? Typical community college student will lose 40% of their credits on average in America when they transfer to a four-year school. And all of the incentive for the institution, for that department chair who's looking at, will I accept these credits into my program? All the incentives for them to say no, right? If they're thinking about the student, they're going to try to be as transfer credit friendly as possible.
Mhm.
But the reality is the fewer credits they take, then their student numbers decline. They're getting less lifetime revenue from that student. The incentives don't align.
So I want
I
to play
think though that
devil's
it's
advocate.
counterintuitive, because I do think that it's like a lot of things, we make these assumptions that we'll make more, or our department will be stronger if we don't accept. The truth is actually the opposite. The more that you support students, the more that you gain students. Michael, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no. Listen, but I'm going to play devil's advocate here, right? Because, I've heard these arguments ad nauseum. I want to be very clear, I'm playing devil's advocate because I don't want people sending me hate mail, right? But, what about the argument about quality control? We cannot pretend that all schools are created equally. We cannot pretend that everyone has embraced the same level of rigor. And if we accept some of these credits from schools that are less rigorous than my esteemed top 40 institution, then we're damaging the value of my degree. I can't trust that someone else is going to teach this class the same way that we teach it here at Top 40U, right? So how do you respond? I mean, and by the way, if those students can't hack it here, they can't adjust here, there are other places for them to go, which we all three know is said behind closed doors.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead,
Go ahead,
Paul.
Mary. No, please.
We did some analysis on I worked in a community college before coming to Bellevue University, and we did a lot of analysis on the perceived discrepancy for rigor and for others. And we found that in most instances, that's perceived, not real, because the motivated student will grab on and learn. The students we find, and I think that faculty would tell you, students transferring in from all kinds of institutions have the same gaps in writing. There's nobody out there in higher ed that has got the magic bullet to make student writing through their English courses or their communications courses perfect. And I think we just work with the student and leverage where they're coming from and where they are. But I will tell you, I think that the difference is more perception. And I think the differences are more with student motivation than what teacher or what school or anything they have. And that's where our faculty have bought into that because they've seen it. They've seen it across the board. So that's my answer to your devil's advocate question.
Yeah,
Paul might
no,
have a better one.
no, it's not a better one because my experience is that our community college students generally, and I don't know when the last time you looked at this, they tend to outperform their peers who often have started with us because you think about oftentimes the kind of grit and perseverance and drive that these students bring on top of their academic performance. I'll take that person who's been knocked down a couple times and got off the mat. I have actually more faith about their ability to complete, and they do. But I'd open the aperture even further and say, this problem then points to an issue with our industry that I don't think we want to grapple with very much, which is that our assessment practices are terrible. And our ability to actually be clear about the claims we make for student learning are vacuous. So quality becomes a set of inputs. So that school's not as good as our school. That courses can't be. Why? Because they don't have the same endowment, because they don't have, right? It's all about status reaching. But if you think about how we actually measure quality, you've got to arrive at competency-based education. And I know I sound like a guy with a hammer where the world looks like a nail, but it's actually the one sort of approach that I think says you have to be crystal clear about the claims you make for what your students can do and what they know. Those two things go together. And you have to have much more rigorous assessment practices. And when I did a sabbatical at the US Department of Ed, we asked AIR to come in and do a primer for the department on assessment practices in higher ed. And the general conclusion was they're dismal. Like if you think about just what good assessment science tells us about reliability and validity, they're very generalized. And then you think about the idea of a faculty member creating their own assessments, which by the way are a reflection on them. And if you have any doubt, take a look at grade inflation across the industry over the last 3 decades. It's astonishing, right? This is not good assessment. So can I judge the ability and skills of someone coming in, transferring in? Probably no better than I can actually judge as an employer the skills and abilities of someone who just graduated from a 4-year program. To your point, you go into any room of CEOs and say, do you routinely hire people with 4-year degrees that don't write well? Every hand in the room is going to go up. To have, mixed quant skills, every hand in the room goes up. We've got a serious problem that we've got to address.
What's interesting about this is what we have discovered with the corporate work program is we're getting real-time assessment.
Great point.
Right. And let me be very, very clear. It is a gut punch. Okay. I mean, you cannot romanticize what you are accomplishing when each semester, when we sit down to evaluate the grades that the employers give the students, the feedback that we're getting, there's some uncomfortable moments because to your point, they're honest moments. The only difference is we're getting them every semester, which then gives us a chance to fix it rapidly, as opposed to waiting until your alums get out in the workplace 2 years, 3 years in, and employers are saying, we really wish you had made it mandatory that everyone takes Excel. I mean, our first certificate program is Microsoft Office. And the reason for that is because you need to be able to handle PowerPoint. You need to be able to handle Excel. There's just some fundamental skills. And by the way, our data show that if you have a Microsoft Office certificate, you can earn a really nice living. Like you automatically can get people out of poverty with that one certificate.
Yeah.
I had a less enlightened soul than the two of you say to me, well, if they can get those jobs right out of one semester or getting one certificate, why do they stay? And I'm looking at them, and it was one of those moments where you just wanted to just shake them, right? And I just wanted to say to them, because, and that's what I said to them, I said, because if that's what we can do with one certificate, imagine what we can do if you stay with us until we get you a degree.
Yeah.
And I think Michael, so glad you offer that, because I think sometimes people hear us talking about the importance of shorter term programs, stackable, and they sometimes think we're saying a degree is not important. I'd say just the opposite. We can see what's happened in the pandemic. We know who lost their jobs. It's overwhelmingly people of color without degrees and women, and they do need degrees. I think all we're saying is that we can get people there with the kinds of skills that are high demand that help them get better jobs. And for many people, it may be that they don't do it in a clean sequence. It may be that they have to sort of take it over time, and that's okay. That's how most of America learns right now, right? 14% of students are first-time, full-time, living on a campus, freshmen. It's not the majority of students any longer. Bellevue has the majority of students. Paul Quinn has the majority of students. That's what America's college students look like.
Yeah. The other cool thing about the partnership that all of us have is with the guild relationship, we are getting, Michael, we don't have the same work program. We've thought about it, and I admire your college for doing it. I think it's a great model. But we get that from our corporate partners on an ongoing basis. And I think that's one of the beauties of being in a relationship like Guild is getting that feedback from the corporations and being able to get it across a set of colleges and a set of corporations. So we're not having, it's a many to many really robust conversation. I'm very thankful for the Learning Solutions Group and the Guild Group who've helped us dive further into this. It's an overwhelming challenge, Paul. I couldn't agree with you more about assessment. And the real assessment is how well can they apply what they learn? How do they do in their long-term career progression?
And I think the conversation that relationships created by, you mentioned guilds, of course, the conversations that Guild allows us to be in not only helps us think, I think, more robustly about what are the programs we have to create, what are the skills for which we're training. This conversation, this sort of description is often higher ed is out of touch with workforce. Honestly, I think it goes both ways. I think we help employers think better and harder about what they need, because quite frankly, they often don't have up-to-date job descriptions. They often haven't gone deep. It's one thing to say, I want people to work well in teams. Okay, well, we can all say that. But what does that mean in your particular industry? What is it? That looks very different from industry to industry, from profession to profession. I'll give you just one quick example. We were working with the healthcare system, and we said, we want to be more attuned to your needs in hiring. So let's talk about the competencies that you need. They said, we need people in our huge chain of nursing homes to be able, they have to work well in teams. But when we started drilling down, what they really meant when you looked at it was that there was about 20 minutes of teamwork every day for most of their staff, and it was when the shift changed. So the reality is they mostly worked largely alone with a set of patients, let's say 20 that they were assigned to that day. But at the end of the day, they had to be like attuned to each other, because oh, Mrs. So-and-so is not, I don't like her heartbeat. We got to sort of check on her tonight a little bit early if you don't mind, and blah, blah, right? And that 20 minutes of teamwork was life and death, but it wasn't teamwork the way another group of engineers might be working on a project in a room all together. It was the opposite of that. So we're helping, I think, when we do our job well in that conversation, we're helping employers be better as well. We both have to be better at that, at this connection.
One of the things that I think is exciting about this model, right, of employer-based partnerships is it speaks to something that Mary spoke directly to, is motivation, right? So the motivation question is solved, right? Frankly, I think the retention question is solved, right? The very best retention officer that I have found is an employer. Okay, they are going to make sure that employee shows up, that they are serious. They've got dual support systems in place, with the job and with the institutions. And look, we all know it's so much more efficient to grow your own and develop your own people than to have to go out and continuously find others. And it's just, there's a simplicity to this model that really has you sitting there thinking like, why didn't we do this before?
Well, I think no one's been better than Bellevue in terms of measuring ROI on investments in employees, and you guys have sort of led the way nationally and the kind of making the case. And I think employers are catching up with that finally. Like they realize that the cost of turnover, the cost of hiring, is very high as opposed to upskilling their people.
Yes, and it's a hard one. And I think that it goes back to, I think, some assumptions and myths about what investment in employees does. Because I used to hear a lot of companies thinking, well, if I educate them, I'm educating them to leave. Quite frankly, you're
Wow.
educating them to stay and take advantage of that. And I know one time years ago, Mutual of Omaha, you're probably familiar with, told me that the highest retention rates came from graduates of Bellevue at their place of employment. And it goes back to Paul and Michael, what you said, align the degree programs with the skills that they can use. My greatest joy comes from hearing students say, I was able to apply what I learned. I was able to really motivate my team. We're now the #1 team in the company, or you can go on and on and on with it. But I do think that linkage is huge. And it is very hard to measure human capital and the investment in human capital. It's the one area of economics which we as a nation are the weakest in. And Paul and I have had several conversations about this. We're still in a learning curve on that, and we're still working it, but we keep trying. Thank you.
I know our time is dwindling. Maybe we should, Michael, whoever wants to go first, but kind of final thought, like there are a lot of people in this room trying to sort through what will be, I think, pretty cataclysmic changes in our industry. Higher ed's going to have to come out. We're going to come out of this pandemic differently than the way we went in. When you think about the enormous needs facing the country today, record levels of unemployment, people going back to work, but jobs look very different, but deepening inequity, like haves and have-nots, leave people being left behind. How do you think about your institutions and the role they play in that mix? And the criticality of partnerships with employers and with intermediaries like Guild, how does that figure into your answer? What's Bellevue's sort of role in helping America build back stronger?
Thank you for the way you framed that question, Paul. It's a great. Ours really comes down to recognizing that our best work is through relationships and partnerships, because I want to work with the community colleges, with the students, with the corporations, with the government agencies. It's a collaborative effort. There's not a single silver bullet, and there's not clear answers. It's a work in progress. And I think the most important thing is to think strategically, both in the corporate side and in the university side, and come together, or community college, come together thinking about, what am I trying to change? Am I trying to get works upskilled? Am I trying to improve access and bottom line? Am I trying to reduce the turnover at my company? I think those conversations and those relationships are what build the partnership that we need in the United States to move this economy in this country forward.
When I think about the inequities, we are a historically Black college university. We were founded to speak to the inequities that were built into our country. And the reality of it is, our country doesn't like to acknowledge that, right? I mean, we see this time and time again by the current state of affairs in our nation, where people literally would rather teach lies than just simply acknowledge the wrongs that were done. And what we tell our students is, listen, you are not being educated for sunny days, right? Because that's not when leaders thrive, right? We're educating you for when it rains, when it's stormy out, when others are struggling and don't have the ability to step forward. And some of that is just simply speaking to the inequities, right? Saying this is wrong and we have to deal with this with a sense of urgency. Because one of the things that drives me crazy about our industry is we will study something until the wheels fall off, right? And be so slow to act. And it's as if we don't understand that for every semester you delay implementation of a change, you're leaving people in a life that is substandard. And so one of the things that we have tried to push forward is this idea of constant iteration, constant innovation, that no problem is ever fully solved. And that we're going to have to be institutions that spend our time, one eye on the students we have, but one eye on the students that are coming, and try to become more capable of anticipating their needs and anticipate the things that they want, and then not treat the changes we're making as some grandiose gesture of, of kindness, and that we're being so charitable because we see students like you and this. No, design institutions that actually speak holistically to the students who are coming, right? Like love something greater than your own endowment and your own institution, right? Care about the common good, care about the best way we go forward, and then design an institution that speaks to that and continuously redesign it as society evolves. This just happens to be one of the things that just I care the most deeply about and angers me. And I just think if we're going to be in the business of higher education, then we have to be leaders, and we can't just sit back in our cubby hole and go to the same conferences and talk to each other about the same boring stuff. We actually have to engage and be transformational across the board, or we need to get out of the business.
Yeah, I love that. And I think what really pains me, because this is an industry I've spent my life in and I love it. And it's giving me meaning. And the smartest people I know work in higher education for the most part. They work in lots of other places, but people that mean a lot to me. As a first generation college kid, an immigrant, it changed my life. And it was for so long, higher ed was part of the solution to America's social mobility and equity and social justice issues with all of its flaws. And now it's so much seen as part of the problem. We've lost our way, I think. And I think, Michael, that sort of sentiment that you sort of that kind of more than a sentiment, that sort of conviction and passion about how we have to change what we are. I see people in the most traditional institutions who share this pain at what we've become, and they're in pain about the suffering of the country and so many people left behind. They want to be a bit different, but our systems and our structures trap us. And the reality is, we're three schools without huge endowments, without a ton of status. And the result is we could innovate. The greatest impediments to innovation, big endowments, tons of tradition. We've done it this way. Drinking your own Kool-Aid, thinking you're better than you actually may be. And then a regulatory environment that doesn't love change, right? That really isn't about true quality. But we're going to need to sort of come to, I think, a real reckoning about how do we bring America's higher education system back to that place where it was actually an engine of opportunity, where you could get that break, where, three people like us could sort of change the trajectory of our lives. And the opportunities that were available to us feel less and less available to so many students. And it's why we have seen the an industry that was once among the most respected in the country actually just in steep decline in terms of how Americans think of us, right? They don't believe our ROI. They think with a lot of reason that we're saddling them with untenable debt, $1.7 trillion, more than any form of debt except home mortgages, and and that we're not a solution anymore, and they're giving up on us, and we can't give up on them. To your point, Michael, right?
You
We've
know,
got to rethink about. We've got to be in love with our students again.
Paul and Michael, I think one of the hopes I have, and I remain optimistic, because I always think that we have we have inside of us this real passion for the country and for success that's been with us. I'm optimistic. I'm hoping that in some ways, I hate the pandemic. I'm sorry about the losses. I never thought we'd be living through this, but I hope this is a real catalyst for making those changes, and we start getting out of our way. We use this as a key way to rethink, redo, and move forward.
That's a nice positive note to end on. I think we're out of time, but it's sometimes things have to be terribly broken for them to be fixed, and maybe that's what the pandemic has done. I like to think we will, to your point, we will emerge from this perhaps on a path towards restoration as opposed to more of the same.
Thanks, everybody. Nice to be with you today.
Yeah, and thanks to the South by Southwest EDU team and all the attendees who joined us. Wish we were in the same room together, especially since we're all talking about how cold we are. It would be nice. But we're coming out of the pandemic. The good news is vaccines are coming. They're coming fast, and there's light at the end of the tunnel. I look forward to seeing all of you, my colleagues and my friends, next year when we can be together in the same place.
Be safe until we see you again.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.